Hi, this is Dr. Frank Chopatini, the head advisor for the Church of Rational Truth. Today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about drugs and morality. So hopefully it's a pretty interesting video. Want to start off with saying that this is going to be just general talk. It's not going to be, for those of you who are looking for something that's just going to be, oh, drugs are bad, don't ever do drugs. That's not really going to be what this conversation is about. It's going to be much more of an open conversation or an open lecture about why people do drugs and what is good and bad about it. If we're going to try to be fair and unbiased, we hopefully can look at what's good and bad, not just going, oh, everything's bad. Let's just not have an open discussion about this and try to see multiple viewpoints. So first off, I work in child psychiatry. I do some addiction work in terms of medicine. So I have seen a fair deal of drug and alcohol addiction. It is fairly rampant, and I do see some commonalities on why people do drugs. One of the most common reasons, I would say probably the most popular reason, or the most common reason, I shouldn't say popular probably, that people do drugs is a lot of times they are trying to treat something. They are trying to treat an emotional disturbance or a psychiatric problem that they're dealing with, either a past trauma, emotional lability, guilt. They're trying to fix that thing, and to fix that thing, they go to drugs or alcohol. Many times that is just their quick solution, or that is the solution that they have found that works for them. They usually try to just avoid the big picture issue, or they try to avoid the emotions that are based on the previous event or the things that they're trying to work on, and drugs act as their escape. I would say that is probably the most common thing that I see, but then again, I'm a very biased source. I'm going to be seeing those people who have been having psychiatric issues or who have issues that they can't get over. And so I don't know if that is the most common overall, but that is definitely, in my experience, what I've seen as the most common reason people fall into drugs and alcohol. The second most common reason that I've seen is usually someone is having a brain pattern that just gets a chemical addiction, which is kind of a different reason for doing drugs. Is people many times can have a brain that has receptors that are very sensitive to a particular molecule. That receptor gives them a pleasure response, and that pleasure response is so great that their brain wants to continue doing it despite consequences, despite possibly severe consequences. This is the time where you'd hear of people saying, like, I broke my leg, I got put on OxyContin or oxycodone, and that's what started the pill addiction. It is just like a light switch that you turn on and you cannot turn off. Once your brain kind of becomes aware of it, now it is the only thing that makes the brain kind of feel normal or feel regular again. That's a very different type of addiction. It's a very different reason why those people use drugs. A lot of times you'll see that run in families more. You'll see people with alcohol addiction or with specific addictions to like amphetamines or opiates. Many times that will run in families because you see them have similar brain responses, similar chemical responses to those. So it is the type that you're more likely to see. Yeah, my dad had alcoholism, my grandfather had alcoholism. Usually it's that their brains will just be structured to be more likely to be at risk for that response, where they will just get the bigger pleasure response that other people won't get. Obviously, some people are the exact opposite, where they will do smoking, alcohol, tobacco, hard drugs, and their brain will do the opposite response. It'll give them a really negative response to it, or will not get pleasure at all. Those are the people who are not very likely to be getting addicted or to be doing drugs because of that response, because it's a clear negative. They don't enjoy it. In fact, they get a deterrent to it, so they're less likely to be addicted and to fall into that pattern. The third and the least common reason I see people doing drugs, I don't know how common it is in reality, because the people who are doing it for this reason don't usually come in to see me, are the people who just have nothing else to do, or they say they do it for fun. This is usually the person who is on unemployment, who is just like, I have 120 hours a week where I'm just doing nothing, so I decided to just use my money to crack open a beer and have a drinking habit. Or the person who wants to say, I'm doing this because it makes me feel alive or it makes me feel good. Who knows if that's actually true, or if it's one of the other reasons, but some people just do it as a time fill or as recreation or something that they enjoy doing. I don't see a lot of that because I'm clinical. I see the people who come in with a problem. I don't see the people who just go, I don't have a problem, or the people who don't think that they have a problem. So those are the most common reasons I see. Obviously, that's not all inclusive. That's not to mean that that is absolutely true, that there's hard data that I'm backing that up with. I'm just speaking in terms of my experience with people I've seen who commonly use drugs and alcohol. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about, the clear negatives of drug and alcohol. I think that's an easier way to get to this because everybody talks about the negatives. So let's kind of start there. Usually the big negatives are physical, like damage to your body, damage to your relationships with others. Different drugs are more damaging than other ones. I can't just say like, oh, all drugs are bad because all drugs hurt. There's a different level of how much hurt there are to drugs. Some that are completely legal, like I'm going to include caffeine, because caffeine is a drug. Caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, those in most areas are completely legal. And it's because they have a much lower threshold of damage that they could do. Alcohol, depending on the amount, if you're a heavy alcohol drinker, yeah, that can do a lot of damage. In fact, alcohol at very high levels can kill you in only a couple of years. If you overdose on alcohol, that could kill you immediately. So it is something dangerous. It is something where in the medical community, we even argue are low levels safe or low or moderate doses. There's some possible benefits that some studies have seen on low or low moderate drinking, especially in terms of the elderly and fighting dementia, but they're very mixed studies. They're not very strong studies. There's been a lot of mixed studies on longevity in alcohol. Do you live longer if you drink small amounts? Do you die sooner? Most of the studies all agree that heavy drinkers usually die younger. People who are light to moderate drinkers, it is very mixed, and it seems like it's how you interpret the data more than anything. I don't think that there's like a hard and fast stance right now. I think every couple of years it changes a little bit. I remember when I was going through medical school, it used to be light to moderate drinkers, basically for men, 2 to 3 drinks a day maximum, and women 1 to 1.5 drinks maximum was, like the upper limit of, okay, that's if you're doing that, you don't necessarily have to change. Some recent studies came out in the last couple of years that were saying that even light amounts of drinking could increase mortality total. I think those were kind of skewed data because I think they included car accidents and home accidents in terms of alcohol-related fatalities. And that's really looking at a public health perspective, not a personal health perspective. So that study kind of like shifted the analysis of alcohol use. So I don't know if I want to necessarily interpret it through that data. I would probably interpret it of hey, how much does just alcohol alone damage my particular health? Not necessarily me going out drinking and driving or someone else drinking and driving possibly hurting me. Yes, that is important to look at it that way, and it's important to, base your laws and your morality based on that. But I wouldn't necessarily tell someone, oh, drinking is bad because of your health. Theoretically, someone else could drink and hurt you. It's kind of a little skewed and possibly an introduction of bias. Obviously, drinking and driving is not good. In the vast majority of cases, it's going to be very hard to argue that drinking and driving is a good thing. That should be very clear. But that's hard to analyze the data if you're going to try to make a moral, objective, health-only argument of any low amounts possibly being beneficial or not beneficial. So I would say it probably depends. We'll have to get more data on it. There'll have to be more research on, low and moderate amounts of drinking to see, are they overall helpful or harmful? I can't say any amount does definitely change things in terms of health because there's certain cancers, especially stomach cancers, esophageal cancers that are clearly increased with drinking. Liver cancers are increased with drinking. Even in, I think, small amounts, I'd have to be looking at the data to quote it directly. So please, if someone sees that I'm slightly off with something, I'm not checking books on this. I'm going based off memory. So those types of drugs, they have much, much less of an effect on health. Some drugs like hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, uh, they have a much stronger amount that they damage your health, and it's somewhat dose dependent and somewhat response dependent, somewhat use dependent. And when I say use dependent, it means is someone using dirty needles, and they're not trying to filter anything that they're putting themselves at risks for blood infections, direct damage to veins, direct skin infections, which I've seen a good amount of people who are using IV drugs. Are you predisposed to something like with cocaine use? It can cause heart arrhythmias, heart attacks, and some people are going to be very predisposed to those things. I would say cocaine is one of those ones where I always worry that you can get a stroke or you can get an arrhythmia kind of out of nowhere, even with not ridiculous levels of usage. So that's always something that's concerning. I don't want to get into too many personal stories of people I've seen in the hospital at young ages with strokes because of cocaine, but it definitely has happened in the past. So those ones definitely have a much higher risk in terms of individualized health risks. Some of them have almost negligible. I would say many of the psychedelic drugs are very hard to say what is the long-term health risks. There's not a huge number of studies on them. I would say a lot of it is probably psychiatric. I've heard definitely some colloquialisms of people using psychedelics and then having a very, very life-changing experience because of them, and not necessarily in a positive way, because I've heard it both ways, where some people could use a hallucinogenic drug like LSD or mushrooms, and have a very spiritual awakening experience. But then there's definitely the cases where people have had very traumatic experiences and had that really shake their core beliefs and their mental state. So that is one thing to look at in terms of the negatives of drugs is that they can all have a different extent on health. Another aspect is financial and social. Drugs themselves have a great cost, both in just individual costs and cost to society, especially illegal drugs. Illegal drugs, there's a lot of money that is spent on trying to regulate them, a lot of money that is spent on trying to fight drug dealers, a lot of money that's spent trying to fight damage in that. And so many times because of drugs, you get this additional negative. Another one is the family negative, if we're going to talk about social aspects. Many times drugs can make families fall apart. Many times it can cause strife. Many times it can cause neglect. I've seen neglect many cases with the child psych where a family member is doing drugs and they end up either abusing their children or usually neglecting their children or making very, let's just say, poor parenthood choices because of drugs. And usually those are more of the people who have a very unhealthy addiction to drugs, where they are willing to put the health and safety of their own family members second to that of finding drugs, using drugs, or being under the influence of drugs. That is, I would say, one of the biggest negatives is how it affects others and how it affects family members. Let's see what else we can do with negatives for drugs. I would say those are the biggest overarching off the top of my head. If we're going to talk about them, we should probably also talk about the positives. And this is probably where we're going to get some critique, or a lot of people saying, how could there possibly be anything beneficial about drugs? Well, people do drugs. They do them for a reason. It's not because people do drugs because they're bad people. People do drugs because they have a perceived benefit, or they seem like they're getting something out of it. I would say the most obvious, or one of the ones that's the most reason, is just pleasure. Many times people do drugs because they get a pleasure response. It feels good for them to do drugs. That is how the chemical addiction works. You do drugs, it releases dopamine, it releases the feeling of pleasure and happiness. And so people do it for that. It's kind of crazy to think that there's not some other big reason for them doing it. It is, this feels good, I do it. Now, whether there's a greater meaning to that happiness, I would argue probably not. It seems like very shallow or empty happiness. But if you were to put a button on your desk and it was to make you feel happy, and you could push that button at any time, a lot of people would choose to push that button to just feel happiness. It's kind of a shortcut to happiness. That's how a lot of people fall into the trap of using drugs, is because They have something going wrong in their lives. They don't have happiness in their lives. So it is a shortcut to making your brain feel happy. I mean, that can be good, but that can also be bad in that it can trap you into that because it's not a true long-term happiness. Other reasons people do drugs is, or other perceived benefits of drugs, they can do other things than just happiness. I mean, if I'm including caffeine, even though most people are not going to be coming to this to hear a talk about caffeine as a drug, caffeine is a stimulant. Caffeine keeps you awake. Caffeine gets you to do more work more efficiently. It gets rid of drowsiness. That has some other benefits to it. That is similar to why people do methamphetamines. That's similar to why people do cocaine. That's the reason why many people do nicotine. It is a stimulant. It keeps you up, awake, active, doing more things. Now, whether that's actually helpful or harmful is really dependent on the situation. And I could probably make the argument for any drugs that even caffeine, to enough of an extent, can be where the benefit is clearly outweighed by the negative. If I'm drinking 13 Monster energy drinks and my heart's going to explode, I'm probably doing a lot more negative than positive there. So I'm not going to... It's going to be hard for me to make the argument that I'm just doing a little bit of meth to help me with work. I'm sure many people do try that, but I would say that's very hard to say that benefit of being up and more aware is more helpful. After saying that, I am now realizing how many people I'm treating for ADHD and basically giving them a version of meth for it. So you could probably see how it's not always as straightforward as just these are all bad. I mean, ADHD medications or many medications are actually very similar or the same as these drugs. Just like there is heroin that can be used and abused, there is morphine, and there is OxyContin and oxycodone and hydrocodone, and they can either be used as a good drug or bad drug. I think this is a nice transition into one of the topics that I usually talk to a lot of my patients about, is actual medical drugs like prescription drugs and street drugs. And I usually say that there is really not a huge line between those, and I think that's going to be a bit controversial as well. But the reason I say that is because a lot of it comes down to why are you using it? You know, this is also why prescription drugs are now one of the biggest problems in the United States in terms of abuse, when really they were meant to help people. It depends on context. Same with the morality. I don't want to get preachy and talking about the morality of drugs, because I'd rather have people weigh the risks and benefits. And if you know anything about the church, morality is relative. You need to look at the risks and benefits. And the same thing goes for prescription drugs and hard drugs or street drugs. What is the reasoning for this person doing it? Is there more harm than good? Is there more good than harm? With medicine, we give people drugs that are hopefully helping them. We look at it and we go, these are the good things that this drug is going to do, with actual psychiatric drugs like antidepressants and actually benzodiazepines, which are a very addictive drug. Same with stimulants. How much benefit are we going to do with these things? How much negative is there in terms of direct health? So, like, let's say I'm putting someone on sleeping medicine that could increase their risk of sleep apnea or dying in their sleep. That can cause a clear negative health outcome. Stimulants can raise blood pressure, can put strain on the heart. Clear health outcome that could be negative. So you have to weigh the positives and negatives. And just like street drugs, you could do a lot of harm with something that's just a prescription drug. I've seen this all the time in practice, where we're using not controlled, not addictive drugs like, let's say, Prozac or fluoxetine. And I'm not bashing this. You could do this with just about any drug, not any specific one, so please don't try and sue. But you could use a drug that should be nice, useful, and helpful in a way that's not very helpful. And since I think one of the big themes of this talk should be psychiatric health and doing drugs, something like a prescription drug, like an antidepressant, can be good or it can be bad. And it really depends on the use and what we're trying to do. The example I give is as a coping mechanism, drugs count, both legal and illegal. If someone has a problem, they can go to a doctor and get a drug. If someone has a problem, they go to a drug dealer and get a drug. It is all trying to fix some problem or try to cope with some problem. Doctors can be, I don't want to say as bad as drug dealers, but theoretically, it is absolutely possible that a doctor can do as much harm as a drug dealer with prescribing, because sometimes those prescription drugs are a good coping mechanism or a good solution, but sometimes those are just as bad as getting a street drug for your solution. And I always say, what are you fixing with this? What problem are you trying to fix with drugs? If it is with an antidepressant, if you are just born predisposed to anxiety and depression, everything's going great in your life, but you're still feeling that anxiety and depression, okay, those drugs are made to help alleviate that, to make you just not feel those feelings inappropriately and get you to a level that is more normal. Just like with street drugs, if your real problem is that you're having trouble at home, you're in a rocky relationship, you're not happy with your life, and you need to change it, but you really don't want to put in the effort to change, I can absolutely make you not worry or not depressed about those things with a regular medicated drug, like a regular non-street drug, like an antidepressant. The problem is, when I'm doing like that, many cases I can be doing harm because I'm allowing someone to stay in a bad situation, or I can allow someone to not actually deal with bigger problems. So, for example, if someone's in an abusive relationship and they're getting physically hurt or psychiatrically hurt or psychologically hurt in that relationship, and then I just give them an antidepressant to not feel bad about that, well, I haven't really fixed the problem there. I've just made the person be okay with still being in a bad situation. They haven't fixed the problem. If anything, I've just enabled them to stay in a bad situation, and they might wake up 10, 20 years down the road and realize they should have left this situation a long, long time ago, but they never did because they never had that intrinsic impetus to get out of the relationship. They covered it up really well. This happens a lot with PTSD, with sexual trauma molestation, is someone uses the drugs to just avoid it. They use the drugs to cover it up, and they can use prescription drugs. Like, you can say, hey, I just want to have so much of an antidepressant and so much of a benzodiazepine that I am just not feeling anything, that I don't feel emotions, and that I'm very flat. And you don't really fix any of the trauma, you don't fix any of the past issues, and that person just bottles it up away and doesn't deal with it. They can do the exact same thing, and I see this quite a bit, where people will do it with illegal drugs. They will just use the illegal drugs to numb themselves or not feel it. I'm sure a lot of people watching can probably think back and think to an uncle, a father, a relative, a friend who definitely had issues going on or probably had past issues. And instead of actually dealing with those past issues, they just go straight to their drug of choice to try to avoid it as strongly as they can. So they just don't feel those feelings anymore. So if I was going to talk about generally prescription drugs, non-prescription drugs, and drug use on whether it is something good or bad, you need to look at the big picture. You need to see, okay, what benefits or perceived benefits am I getting from taking this drug? And then what harms am I getting from taking this drug? And then really weigh it. Is it worth this or is this not worth it? This is what doctors should be doing when they're prescribing the prescription drugs. Just like if someone is thinking about doing a prescription or even an illegal or non-prescription drug, what benefit do I get out of this? Is it outweighed by the negative of taking it? So if I'm going to have a cup of coffee in the morning and have caffeine, that has a nice benefit. I can be more awake, more alert, get more work done. But just as it can be 1 a.m. and I'm getting tired, I could have a cup of coffee to do the same effect. But there's more negative of me taking a cup of coffee at midnight because it might worsen my next day. I might be more tired. I might get addicted to caffeine, whether you want to be stretching that definition or not. That is the same thing as if I'm going to say, hey, am I going to do heroin? If I'm going to do heroin, what benefit am I going to get? Yeah, I'm not going to feel horrible right now. I'm going to feel possibly pleasure for a little bit, but also what is the negative? I can end up overdosing and killing myself. I can end up destroying my family, my loved ones, my relationships. I can end up going to jail. Clearly, you can weigh the positive and the negative, and you could see, yeah, this is clearly immoral, or this is probably not a decision I should be making, versus no, I don't see this negative. I see a perceived positive. I've got good data that says it is positive more than negative, and then make a decision based on that. And I think that's a much more rational approach to it. I think that's a good way of people looking at what they're actually doing. And I think if someone is thinking about drinking alcohol, smoking a cigarette, having a cup of coffee, taking a prescription drug, look, what benefit are you doing by doing that thing? Are you fixing the real problem you're getting at? Are you actually getting a true benefit from doing that thing? Or is there more negative that's really going to outweigh any kind of benefit that you're getting from that? Now, obviously, that's the reason why many people think hard drugs are bad and you should not do hard drugs. And I agree for the most part. I would say most hard drugs are done as an avoidance mechanism. Most hard drugs probably are doing more negative than positive. But there's definitely some research in some drugs about whether they can cause a net benefit. I would say the biggest one nowadays that's gaining some more leeway in the scientific and medical community is many of the psychedelic drugs. Many times, things like LSD, mushrooms, ketamine, they may be useful in treating refractory depression. They may be useful in treating PTSD, but we're still looking at data for that. And this is the benefit of taking a rational approach. If we actually look at the data, we analyze it, we take a scientific approach and kind of weigh the positives and negatives in a really frank, open manner, then you can see, is this thing actually going to possibly give a benefit rather than just putting out a blanket statement and saying, hey, all drugs are bad, don't do drugs. But you could have possibly lost out on a whole lot of potential benefit if you just looked at it and actually was open and honest about the conversation rather than just throwing everything under the bus and going, hey, everything here is bad. Don't do any of these things. We're going to ban it. We're going to make it illegal. Let's actually look at what is positive, negative, and then make a rational, informed decision based on facts and figures. So I would say that's a good enough talk now. If you all want us to have a bigger talk about drugs or more specific talks about drugs, or even go into individual drugs, I mean, this is a huge topic, and there's probably a lot of places we can go down in. Hopefully, I can provide more just information, and hopefully, this can start a conversation with you, maybe even family members, maybe even children on, what is going on with their drug use, or what is their opinion or their morality on drug use. As the church is concerned, it's always risk benefit. What is good about it? What is bad about it? What is the morality of the individual situation? Because different situations are going to have different morality and ethical implications. I can't easily just say, hey, don't ever smoke, don't ever drink, don't ever use caffeine, because it depends. It really all depends. So I would say be rational. Look at it, try and gather information, and try to make a reasoned decision on it. And that goes for everything, not just drugs. But thank you so much. I hope this wasn't too long of a video. I hope some people either learned some things or at least sparked some interesting topics for debate. Hopefully we will see you all next week. I've got to see if we got a financial report next week or not. We will not next week because it's still technically going to be in May. But then after that, we'll go over our May financial report, which I'm sure everybody will be super excited to hear about, because that's probably boring for some people and very exciting for others. I like it, but I don't think everybody else feels the same way. I will talk to you all then, and thank you so much for spending your time with me this week. Bye-bye.